All right. Thank you so much for coming. Today, we are going to be digging into some HTML and CSS. And if you haven't been paying attention to HTML and CSS recently, I guess I can't really blame you. The world of web development has been moving at an absolutely breakneck pace, and there's just no way to keep up with literally everything. With most folks now in web dev working in the world of frameworks, it can feel especially easy to overlook our old steadfast friends, HTML and CSS. In fact, maybe let's have a quick show of hands. Who here has written vanilla CSS in the last, let's say, week? I'm talking no Sass, no Tailwind, no, yeah, I'm watching hands go down as I'm listing those things off. Just you and the CSS. Only a couple. And yet, while you weren't looking, this stuff has been jumping forward in leaps and bounds. In fact, I bet there's a bunch of stuff that you're doing using external libraries or preprocessors that you could actually replace with some good old-fashioned HTML and CSS. So before we dive in, I should probably introduce myself. I'm Kathryn Grayson Nanz. I'm a senior design and developer advocate at Progress Software. I started off as a print designer, and I slowly wandered my way over here to UI design and front-end development. Because of that more design-focused background, I especially love to spend my time on the front of the front end, which means my dream day would be to write nothing but CSS. Over the years, I have determined this is an unpopular opinion. But it's fun. You should try it. We can fight about it in the parking lot later. Or if you want to talk about something else, genuinely please talk to me about Doctor Who. I am dying to discuss the new season. There is a lot to cover today, so I had to narrow it down somehow. So everything we talk about has been added sometime in the last 5 years. Although for the couple of you that I know are going to be very specific and double check me, some of these were proposed or introduced as a spec earlier than that. We're going to start with CSS, and then we'll do just a quick peek at HTML. But there is going to be another great talk at Stir Trek today called Hot New HTML Features. So I'm going to be very lazy and let that speaker do the heavy lifting on the HTML front. A little bit more on that when we get there. Now, personally, I tend to play things pretty safe and not implement features until the can I use board is bright green. So everything we're going to talk about today has full modern browser support across Edge, Safari, Firefox, Chrome. Whenever there's an exception to that, like a specific mode or a value that's not supported everywhere, I will take a note of it specifically. But as far as like general ability to use these features go, you are good to use all of this in your applications and your websites today. This very morning, in fact, if you're feeling especially ambitious, which I can only assume that all of you are because you showed up for a conference talk at 8:30 in the morning. So starting off with CSS, let's take a look at is and where. Is and where are two new ways for us to write compound selectors with a little bit more clarity and less hassle. So by compound selectors, we're just kind of saying a fancy way for us to say styles that apply to multiple elements, right? And this is especially useful when we want to do things like apply the same color across all of our text or zero out the defaults on lots of different base elements. So for a long time, the way we did this was using comma-separated lists like this. Now we can use is or where to do the same thing with actually a very similar syntax. So what's the benefit? Why would we use is or where instead of sticking with what we already know? And when should we use is versus where and vice versa? Starting with that first question, one of the main perks of is or where is that it's going to be a lot more forgiving than the old school list. Because before, if any part of your CSS selector was not valid, the whole thing was going to get scrapped. So it's one of those things that's both nice and kind of annoying about CSS is that invalid code will still work, just not the way you expected it to. Right? It's not going to crash your app. It's not going to throw errors. It's just going to skip things or guess what you meant. So let's say you had a selector list that had like 5 different elements, and your coworker updates the class name for one of those, but forgets to update it in the selector that you made. That CSS is now broken. The styles that you defined are not going to apply to any of the 5 elements, because the inclusion of the one class name that no longer exists makes it invalid. That sucks. But if you use is or where, that won't happen. Now it can just skip over that no longer existing class name, and it will apply the styles to the rest of the list items as you intended. Another nice benefit of is where is the ability to simplify nested styles, because you can include multiple is statements in a single definition. So we don't necessarily have to list out all of the nested stacks explicitly. So something that looked like this can now look like the is by chaining is statements, which is a lot more human readable and generally just kind of more pleasant all around. Thus far, is has gotten all of the attention in the examples, and we've kind of glossed over where. And that's because for a lot of use cases, is and where are going to behave mostly the same. The difference between them has to do with their respective levels of specificity, which gives me a great excuse to do a deep dive on the topic of CSS specificity, which I think is cool as hell, and hopefully you will too in just a moment. So you likely already knew some methods of styling will override others when you're writing CSS. So for example, a style that's applied to a class will be preferred over one that's applied to a base element. So in the example here, the header with the class name will be red, even though we said all the H2s should be blue. That's because CSS weights the class as more specific than the element, and therefore will prefer the styles assigned to that. But there is more to this process than some kind of mysterious rock, paper, scissors game happening in the back room of the browser somewhere. In fact, CSS specificity is calculated using points and written using a 4-digit notation in which each identifier in a style definition is kind of tallied. So, for example, if we look here, we would read this specificity level as 0112. Because there are no inline styles in a CSS file, right? That's in the HTML. We have one ID, the nav, one class, the menu, and then 2 elements, the list and the anchor. So when 2 different styles are applied to the same thing, their specificity levels are compared using this kind of notation, and the higher one wins. So in this case, if we added another class, it would become 0122, and it would override the one we looked at earlier. Or if we added an inline style, that would make it 1112, and that would be the winner. And for better or worse, an important will override everything, no contest, so please don't do that if you could possibly avoid it. Now you may be thinking, why don't we just read these as numbers, right? Why can't we say 112 versus 122 or 1,112, right? Because if we're thinking of this as like a base 10-point system, we should just be able to add it up and read it from left to right, right? Unfortunately, it is not quite that easy. We use this particular notation because sometimes we will go over 10 in any individual column. So let's say we put 12 class names on something. I don't particularly encourage you to write anything that includes 12 class names, but I saw some of you during the hand raising, and I know you're Tailwind users, so you guys are why. Here's where reading the values as a number kind of breaks down, right? In that case, our specificity might look like 00121, and if we were to just read that left to right, we'd be thinking, 121. But the specificity of something with 12 classes and 1 element is going to be very different than something with 1 ID, 2 classes, and an element. That's 121. which could also arguably be read as 121. So the commas and the notation stays in place to keep us from doing that. Okay, back to where. I promise this is relevant. It was neat trivia, but it is also relevant. When we use is, the specificity level is determined by the most specific thing in that list in the brackets. But when we use where, the specificity is always 0, 0, 0, 0. So that means that here, right, with this is, that's all, H1, H2, H3, that's going to have a specificity of 0, 0, 0, 1. The specificity level is defaulting to the highest in the is list. So if we added this main ID, we see that shift, right, 0, 1, 0, 0. However, if we're using where in either of those situations, both with or without the ID, the specificity is always going to be 0, because where's specificity is always 0. So that means if we're really feeling particularly fancy, or we've written ourselves into a terrible CSS corner, we can start to use where to our advantage to manipulate these specificity rules a little bit. If we have something included in that list that we don't want to throw the specificity off, if we intentionally want to keep something at that 0 level so that it can be more easily overridden, where is really handy. However, I will admit, the vast majority of the time, you're probably just going to reach for is. Most of the time, that's what I do. An early version of is was originally released as WebKit Any way back in 2010. But is, as we know it today, was added to Firefox and Safari in 2020, with Chrome and Edge picking it up the next year, 2021. Now, let's talk about something a little bit simpler than that, which is accent color. For a long time, the lack of ability to style native form elements was kind of the deciding factor in developers reaching for things like custom component libraries. Because if you've ever had to look a designer in the eye and explain why you can't change the color of a checkbox, you're like, I'm not doing this again. To have to stare at someone and be like, I can't make it blue, there's no blue support, I'm so sorry. Well, I have great news. We have added blue support, and all the other colors, for that matter, with the accent color property. Accent color can be applied to checkboxes, radio buttons, range sliders, and progress bars. You can define it using all the kind of normal things, color names, hex colors, RGB, HSL, or you can leverage things like inherit, revert, or auto. This is one of those things that kind of feels like it's always been in CSS, like a little bit of that like misremembering effect, because it feels crazy that it has not always been there, honestly. Accent color was added to Chrome, Edge, and Firefox in 2021, with Safari picking it up the next year to complete major browser support. Now, to talk about the property rule, we first need to take a step back and talk about Houdini. Not that Houdini. CSS Houdini, the set of APIs that lets us hook into the CSS object model and, by extension, styling and rendering processes of the browser. Now, the Houdini APIs are very much a work in progress. The paint function is still early days with only partial browser support. That's going to let us add effects like stripes and gradients and textures in CSS, kind of like we do with Canvas. We also know there are future Houdini plans for layout, parser, and font metric APIs. But as of right now, property is the one leading the way with full browser support. So what's special about property? Mostly, it's kind of a step one. It's laying the groundwork for some of those future Houdini features that we know are coming. But it allows us to define custom CSS properties so that we can then use these properties in animations and transitions, which is what makes it useful right now for us today. If you squint your eyes, and I admit this is going to be a little bit of a tenuous metaphor, so hang with me. If you squint, you can think of it like a little tiny sliver of TypeScript in CSS. So let's take a look at this example. Here we are defining a custom CSS property called image size. That syntax descriptor there in that I guess second line is important because it's telling our rendering processor how to interpret the property. If that's left out or invalid, it's not going to work. But we can choose from options like color or string or number or percentage like here Or we can pick a universal syntax definition that we apply with an asterisk, which is kind of like a TypeScript any. The inherits Boolean is a little bit simpler, right? True or false, will or won't this property inherit by default? But just as important, because if we leave it out or it's invalid, again, no dice on the whole property. Initial value pretty much does what it says on the tin, right? It defines a starting default value for our property. And if we set our syntax option to that any using the asterisk, then this initial value is optional. But otherwise, you guessed it, if it's left out or invalid, no property for us. And this is the point at which the very loose TypeScript metaphor falls apart. Because again, as we talked about, the good/bad news with CSS is that it's flexible. And so broken CSS is not going to throw errors or crash the application. And that means that using property will help give the browser all the details that it needs to know what to expect about a property and how it should behave, which is especially important when it needs to do things like animate that property. But it will not do things like throw errors if you have a mismatch between that property definition and the actual value. So in that regard, you can't use it for type enforcement like you would with TypeScript. Property is pretty newly supported across all major browsers. It was first added to Chrome and Edge in 2020, then Safari 2023, Firefox 2024. This is one of my favorites because it's super practical, I think. The color mix function lets us do custom color mixing and blending right in our CSS file, no preprocessors required. This is something that I used to do a lot with Sass, and it's really nice to not have to do that anymore. All we need to do is specify our color space, and then we pick two colors and the respective percentages that we want to include for them. It's very much actually like mixing paint on an actual palette, right? 50% red, 50% blue, mix them all up, you got purple. But in fact, with CSS, you don't even have to define the percentage for both colors if you don't want to. You can just kind of set the percentage for one, and then CSS will automatically do the math for the other. Where this gets especially useful is that you can also feed your CSS variables into color mix. So if you're working with like a design system or something where you've already got a bunch of brand colors defined, you can start doing things like tints, tones, and shades really easily, which is adding white, gray, or black to adjust the lightness or darkness of your hue. And again, that's probably one of the things I reach for most often because it's good for things like kind of darkening the background of a button when it's like being hovered, or if you want to like create a washed out color background, you can really easily start to say like, okay, here's my brand color, add 25% white, add 50% black, you know, just super easy. Previously, I would have defined unique variables for those color versions, or I would have reached for like tint and shade functions in Sass, and now I don't have to. But perhaps one of the most useful ways to leverage color mix, though, doesn't actually involve mixing two colors together at all, ironically. Because you can mix any color with transparent to achieve a partially opaque version of that primary color. So let's say you have your brand color, you mix it 50% transparent, you get a half opacity version of the color. That's really handy for things like when you have a modal pop-up and you want to kind of gray out everything behind it. Just makes it super, super easy. And again, you're not having to like redefine variables so that you end up with this CSS variable list that's like an eon long. When you can just do all of this in the CSS, it means you can keep your variables really focused and much more maintainable. Color mix has been available across all major browsers since 2023, with Safari winning this particular race as the first to add it in 2022. Now, the has pseudo class is a really interesting one, so I do want to spend a little extra time here, because there's a couple different ways that we can leverage it. The has pseudo class does two main things. It can check to see if an HTML tag, class, or ID element contains a specified child element, or it can check to see if that tag, class, or ID element is immediately followed by another specified element. Then it will apply your chosen styles to that HTML tag, class, or ID element, but not the child or following element. One of the coolest parts of the has function is the way in which the styles are applied to the parent element effectively. In fact, some folks do refer to this as the parent selector, which is something that has been historically missing, or at least highly requested from CSS for a long time. Although there is an excellent article by Adrian Bies where they say that has would be more accurately classified as a relational selector, and I do like that terminology a little bit better. That feels a little more accurate. Because it is so different from what we've had available to us in CSS before, it does feel a little unintuitive at first, I think. So let's take a look at some examples. When has is just checking for child elements, it looks like this, right? Which I think is actually pretty human readable. Does this div have an image? If so, apply a green border to the div, to be clear, not to the image. The child tag does not have to be the first child or in any particular position when we write it like this. When we are looking at more general relational positioning, it looks like this using that kind of plus operator. So in this case, we're saying when there's an H1 that's immediately followed by an image, make the H1 green. And again, I feel like I've said flexible like 20 times in this talk, so if you're playing any kind of a drinking game, it's not too late to start. One of the most useful things about has is its flexibility. You can list multiple elements within the parentheses, you can chain has conditions together, you can check for direct children specifically, and all of that combined lets us write some really powerful and really specific CSS. So as mentioned, has will let you put more than one element within the parentheses. So if you want to get more specific about direct children, children of children, you'll start chaining. But if you're just looking to see if all of the elements are present, you can just do a list like this, right? Find any divs that have both images and p tags as children at any depth. So the green styling will still apply even if those children are nested within other tags inside the high-level parent div. We can also specify our has selection to see if the listed child element is a direct child or not, right? Using the kind of caret there. And that indicates that the image has to be a direct child of the div in order for the green border to be arrived. So it would apply to this code, but not to this code, because the image is within the section in the second. If you want to make more complex rules, like this example looking at nested children, you can start to chain has conditions. So here we're looking for images and paragraph tags, but we split them up into two different conditions so that we can change kind of the level of nesting, right? With the image, we're checking to see if that's a direct child, whereas with the paragraph tag, just, is it there? Is there a paragraph as a child at any level? So it will apply to this code, but not to this code, because again, the image is nested. After saying all of this out loud, I do kind of start to understand why people hate CSS. But I promise, this is very cool. And it just takes a little bit of playing around with it for it to start to feel less confusing and more helpful and awesome. This is one where I highly recommend, like, pop up in a code pen and fiddle with it, right? Make some rules and start seeing when it works, when it doesn't. You'll really get the gist quickly. And once you've got those base pieces, you can start to kind of click them together like Legos. So I promise it's not scary. It's a great way to be able to get super specific with your styles. Chrome, Edge, and Safari added has support in 2022. Firefox came shortly after 2023. Container queries were a very long time coming, and folks were very excited about it. I saw somebody cheering just now. Because for a long time, this fell into that, like, we know we're getting this soon category, and so there was a lot of hype around it. And it feels like it took about an age and a half for them to actually get here. But the good news is, they did get here, and now they're supported in all major browsers, and we get to use them, and they are awesome. Container queries work very much like media queries, especially in terms of syntax. But instead of checking the dimensions of the full browser window, they're going to check the dimensions of a specific element on the page. Optionally, we can set names on specific containers and then reference those in our CSS. I prefer to use named container queries, which is nice if you've got especially a lot of container queries on kind of one page or in one style sheet. Naming helps keep everything a lot more organized and readable. So to name a container, we define it with container name, and we set a container type. And if we want to be super efficient, we can even do both at the same time with this shorthand syntax where we separate the name and the type with a slash. And then to call that container, we just add the name between the @container and the conditions in the query, which, like I said, right, looks like a media query. We're just saying @container instead. We can also create more complex rules for those queries by using and, or not. But note that not cannot, get it, be used with and or, whereas you can kind of chain and or. Thus far, all the examples have looked at width and height, but container queries can also look at aspect ratio, block size, orientation, and inline size. Or they can look at scroll state, meaning whether the container is scrollable, whether it's snapped to a parent or ancestor element, or whether it's stuck to a parent or ancestor element. So if those are kind of new to you, scroll snap is what lets us control scrolling behavior by kind of snapping content into position as the user scrolls down, or up, I guess. And then sticky lets us set the position of an element to a specific place as the user scrolls. So like if we have a menu that sticks to the top of the browser as the user scrolls. Chrome, Edge, and Safari had implemented support for this feature in 2022. Firefox lagged behind a little, adding support in 2023, and they are the only browser that still does not currently support the scroll state queries. But you can use everything else. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I am a very lazy developer. I've said it before, I'll say it again. I'm a big fan of any time I get to let the browser do the work for me. And the image set function is really great for this, because it allows us to provide multiple options for an image, and then let the browser do the work of deciding which one is going to be the best fit for the user's device and settings. This is one of those little things that when we include a bunch of little things, they all add up to a really great user experience. Because this means the page can load faster, because users that have slower connections can be served lower resolution images, and our page can look better because the higher resolution image can still be available to be optionally served for users whose devices and connections support it. So you kind of get the best of both worlds. But, and here's the extra cool part, it's not just for image resolution. We can also set it up to select between different image formats. So in this example, maybe we have a client who is really locked in on WebP images and they are demanding that we use them, and maybe a developer is feeling a little nervous about that. So now we can set this option and everyone gets to be happy. Or you don't actually have to use it with images at all. So here's an example where we're offering the same kind of linear gradient, but in different resolutions. Image set has been in the works for a long time. It was first introduced for Chrome and Safari back in 2012, although it really didn't behave much like it does now. It only supported URL images. There was no type option. So image set, as we know it today, became fully supported in Firefox in 2021, and then Chrome, Edge, Safari 2023. Clamp allows us to set a base value for a property along with upper and lower caps to kind of contain it as it adjusts fluidly. This is really handy for getting rid of a bunch of old media queries, because it lets us set those same kind of responsive limits without having to find individual breakpoints in order to do so. The format is to set your minimum value, your base value, and then your maximum value. So in this example here, we say, I want this image to take up 100% of the space by default, but I never want it to exceed the maximum of half of the container size, and I never want it to get smaller than 200 pixels wide. So we're able to say, flow freely within these guardrails. One of my favorite practical uses for Clamp is to set up typography systems. And I will admit, I have shown this example before. So if you happen to have come to my Ditch the Media Queries talk at a past Stir Trek, apologies in advance for this brief bit of repetition, but it's so useful I feel like I've got to mention it. So here we're setting the base font size to 2.5 VW, and that's viewport width for anyone that may not be familiar with the VW unit. 1 VW is going to be equal to 1% of the viewport width. Then, using clamp, we set min and max values on either side to ensure we end up in a situation where the text is never going to be unreadably small, or it's never going to be ridiculously huge if someone has one of those like gigantic, awful curved monitors. If we want to expand on this, we can then use relative units for our other typography. We can base them on this fluid value we defined, and that will allow all of them to kind of flex naturally as well. So just like that, we've kind of created this very flexible, adjustable, automatic typography system in basically one line, which hard to beat, right? Now this one is honestly cutting it very close on the edge of my last 5 years rule, because Chrome added it in late 2019, and the other 3 jumped on shortly after. So if you are measuring strictly, if you're gonna actually me, then it has been just over 5 years since Firefox added support for this in April 2020. However, I think it's one of the most useful, practical, applicable additions to CSS in recent history, and based on other people's code that I get to look at, it's still criminally underused. So I'm the one giving the talk, and I get to do whatever I want. So I say it's been the last 5 years. I'm including it, so there. Text wrap is here for all of our typography nerds. Just me? Just me. Okay. Well, if you've ever been annoyed when some text doesn't wrap if you wanted it to, text wrap can fix that. If you've ever tried to avoid that weird thing where the text will wrap and leave like just one word awkwardly on the next line, text wrap can fix that. Or if you've ever had to add non-breaking spaces between words because you showed it to a client and they said, we can't have a space between whatever, fast-paced. Okay, sure. Text wrap can fix that too. In addition to your basic wrap and no wrap options, which do exactly what you think they'd do, text wrap also offers us balance, pretty, and stable as options for how our text should wrap. Balance is going to wrap text in such a way that the number of characters on each line is evenly divided, or at least as evenly as possible. And this is somewhat limited since it is, as MDN phrases it, computationally expensive. It's only going to do 6 or 10 lines depending on the browser. But honestly, that's mostly a non-issue because most of the time you're going to apply this, you're going to be using it for headers. If you have a header that is more than 10 lines long, you have a different problem that text wrap cannot solve for you. Let's see. Oh, good, the GIF works. This is a great example of showing it wrapping to try and avoid those awkward spaces and gaps and breaks, which is really nice, I think. Pretty is what you're going to reach for if you want to zhuzh up the body copy or anything longer than, say, 6 to 10 lines. It helps to evenly balance longer text blocks as well as do things like minimizing orphans, which is the real and deeply sad word for when you have a single word that wraps onto a line by itself. And then stable is what you'll want for text that is editable by the user. It's going to work basically the same as the default wrap, but the nice thing here is that it will keep the block of text from like rewrapping or shifting as the content is changing. So if a user is writing a huge block of text, it's not going to be shifting around under their feet. This is one that genuinely surprised me a little, because I would have sworn, like really sworn, that text wrap had been around forever. And all I can say is that it's a good thing I'm not a gambling person because I would have lost a lot of money on this one. I think I had it mixed up maybe with word wrap, or that's what I'm telling myself to feel better about it, because text wrap only became supported in 2023. And stable didn't get there until last year. And pretty, in fact, still isn't supported in Firefox or Safari, although it is in the Safari technology preview, so we can expect it to hit pretty soon. The more you know. Okay, I'm going to leave CSS behind in our last few minutes, and I'm going to pivot over to what's new and exciting in the world of HTML. But, as I mentioned before, Alex is here. Right here, in fact, and giving a wonderful talk this afternoon called Hot New HTML Features. So I don't want to spend too much time here. But in a talk called I Didn't Know CSS or HTML could do that, I feel like I would be remiss to not talk about it just a little bit. So I'm going to breeze through, speed run some of the most notable. But if you're still around this afternoon, any of these spark your interest, you should definitely hit up Alex's talk for the deeper dive. Dialog empowers us to build and toggle modals directly from the HTML, no JavaScript required. And this is especially handy because, like all native HTML elements, it's going to come with that sweet, sweet built-in accessibility support. So it's going to automatically handle shifting the focus and enabling keyboard navigation, so you can do things like use the escape key to close. And it's going to have a predefined dialog role for folks using screen readers. Dialog gained full browser support in 2022. Chrome was the first to support it, actually all the way back in 2014. But it would take another several years for Edge to catch up in 2020, and then Firefox and Safari a couple years after that. The inert attribute in HTML allows us to mark an element and all of its descendants as non-interactive. So that means no focusing, clicking, keyboard nav, or searching. Basically, it means it's invisible to the browser and also screen readers. Why would we want this? Why would we want to create HTML that you can't interact with? Well, it's actually really good for use in concert with that dialog element. So when the dialog is up, we can mark everything behind it on the page as inert. So users can't be like clicking buttons or accidentally interacting with stuff that's supposed to be inaccessible behind the modal. Inert got full support in 2023 when Firefox added it. The other three added it in 2022. However, it is worth noting that while inert has Safari support, there is a little bit of a known issue when it comes to the find in-page search feature in Safari. So even if you have marked something as inert, sometimes if someone does that like Command F search in Safari, it will still turn it up. The popover attribute gives us quick and easy tooltips and toast notifications, again, without the JavaScript. So similarly to the dialog, that's going to come with all the keyboard nav and the accessibility support and perks that we expect from native elements in HTML. Popover has 3 modes that we can use. That is auto, hint, and manual. Auto, as you can imagine, is what's automatically applied if no value is set. In this mode, popovers can be closed by hitting the escape key or clicking outside the popover, and they'll also auto-dismiss other popovers that are currently active. Hint is the same, basically, except it does not dismiss the other popovers, and manual requires the user to actively, manually dismiss the popover. So no escape keys, no auto-closing. Popover is brand new in terms of browser support. Firefox added it just last year. However, it should be noted, again, little asterisk here, the hint value is not fully supported everywhere yet. So you're going to have to stick, or I guess users are going to have to stick with Chrome or Edge if they want to leverage that option. Okay, we went through a lot of information very quickly, bit of a crash course, but hopefully it introduced you to at least one new thing that you hadn't heard of or didn't know HTML or CSS could do now. 5 years ago, I think we would have automatically reached for JavaScript or Sass or less or some other dependency in order to make all of this stuff happen. But now we don't necessarily have to. It's just built in, waiting for us to use it in our vanilla HTML and CSS. We've seen this stuff grow hugely recently, expanding on what we can do and starting to kind of make that leap from something that we just think about for static web pages to something that we can really start to think about for modern applications. And yes, there was kind of a chunk of time where they were lagging behind what we really wanted them to do. And in that time, for better or worse, a lot of us turned to JavaScript to bridge that gap. But now the gap is getting smaller, like smaller and smaller every day. And so if you're still using JavaScript solutions to solve HTML and CSS problems, it might be time to give that a second look. And if you're considering adding a new dependency or a preprocessor or something else, maybe just try a quick search first, because HTML and CSS might already do everything that you need. All right, thank you guys so much. If you're interested, I've got QR codes here to see the slide deck or a full transcript of the talk. I'm also going to post those in the Discord. I had intended to be on top of my life and have that done before I gave the talk, but I didn't. So I'll put them up in just a few minutes. And I think we've got just a little time left. I was really hoping to leave like 5 minutes, and I think I managed it. So if you've got any questions, I'm happy to take them, and I will keep an eye on the Discord.